a small recap. Yesterday we went through quite a bit of content, and I was reading the feedback forms, and there was mixed views about how much we went through. And that's the challenge with a mixed crowd. I know lots of people felt pretty good about the volume, but lots of comments about wish we had more time to get into some depth with these activities. We started off with a bit of the framework. We looked at definitions of standards and purposes. We talked about a lot of the principles that normally go into this kind of work. We reviewed processes in a broad way, touched very briefly on a bit of this cycle of feasibility analysis, and we also got an opportunity to hear about the record of achievement in the new essential employability framework. It's a full day, considering that we only arrived here at 12:30 and you know, when we were eating and dining by 6. So yeah, no doubt you should feel pretty full from yesterday. But today we're actually going to not look at this from a theoretical point of view. We're actually going to try some things. We're going to work hard. In fact, the first exercise I'm going to put you on today, I'm sure by the break you're going to say, get me out of here. This is like way too much effort. But it is about trying to apply these ideas. And what I thought we would end up doing today, I'm going to come back to the slide in a moment, is we'll actually start off with working through a work plan. And that's a way to kind of bring together a number of things that we looked at yesterday. That'll be table by table. It's a pretty intensive exercise. Where time permits, we're going to get a little bit into the monitoring and evaluation and some of that other wheel thing, but we'll use it as just opportunities through some debriefing. What we will also look at is a sample of training programs. There's an exercise in here that I want to work on with you. It's a good way to show you how standards are used to inform training. So it's an actual exercise that looks at an actual example from a standard and how a curriculum designer or instructional designer would work with that. It's an exercise we've done a few times, particularly with the education marketplace, and it has proven to be quite successful, but it really does help illustrate the kind of depth the standard contains and how it informs training. So we'll do that exercise. There's a little tool to go along with it in the book. And if time permits, we'll also get into some job description applications. Okay, you're going to have to put your thinking caps on. This is going to be a big job at the moment. We're going to move into developing a work plan. Now, on the tables, I have supplied copies of this basic spreadsheet-looking thing. Everyone is going to use one. And notice it's entirely blank. That's because your job is going to be to fill it out. And it's going to take some time. And it's not going to be easy. The job here is really to try and imagine what it takes to try to design a plan to do a standard. So yesterday we walked through some stages, some broad stages of activity. You have that on in your guidebook, so you can always go back and review them. But remember there were those 6 cycles, right? The first one being planning, and then moving on to stakeholder engagement, and so on. So that's a good general outline that you might use as part of your frame looking at this exercise. Also, there is, well, let's look at that one to start off with. What I'd like you to do at your table is to think about, and this is just an example by the way, don't look at this as a literal list. I'm just using these as headers from some of those categories to give you an idea. But you know, a classic Gantt sheet kind of work plan here we're talking about. Not all the details about your objectives and so on. More just what are the activities and when would you do them? So what we'll do is, I gave you a basic spreadsheet. It's actually more like the one that's here. And I'm going to ask all of you at your tables to work collectively and just try to imagine all the activities you might have to undertake, and more or less in the kind of order that you might undertake them. This is not easy because one, some of you've never done this before. For others, you're not sure what really needs to be involved, so it's a bit of a guessing game. But that's the point. So if you use that general outline of those 6 cycles as your general guide, then think about, well, what would it take to do that planning stage? What would it take to engage stakeholders? What would it take to do this developmental phase? It's not going to be easy. You're going to struggle with some of this. You're going to, you know, find some of it you're not going to find easy answers. That's the point. So working together, brainstorm, think about that, imagine what some of those activities will be. Okay? And then what I want you to do is list them. And imagine when you might plot them out. Now, I've given you a little bit of an example of this, but this is not how you have to do it necessarily. So I'm thinking already, I looked at the planning thing, and I think, okay, well, this is, by the way, with the assumption you've already got your funding and you're going to be able to move on this. So now that you're at that stage, okay, well, one of my first activities might be to get an advisory committee. Another one might be to confirm the scope of the project with the advisory committee. And then I might do some orientation meeting with them so that we can make sure we are organized. And then, okay, I know I'm going to need to get the research done, and in my case, I'm thinking I'm going to hire a contractor. So I'll develop an RFP, and then I'm going to broadcast, and I'm going to select somewhere. Then I'm going to start to do the research, and I think that's going to take me 15 months, and so on. Now, this is all speculative, I know, but I just want you to put some thought to what are the components that you might have to undertake to fulfill those major categories. In our debriefing, what we'll do is we'll look at what you've done, and we'll explore some of the ideas that you came across and the gaps, and we'll talk about them. And so we'll come out of this exercise with a bit of a template of a plan. Okay? What I will do is collect from you those sheets. That's why they're not in your binders. Because I will commit to compiling that in one more or less template. So it'll be like a long list of ideas that were generated. It becomes a bit of a shopping list that you might use to help with planning down the road. Okay? Now, the different level of detail you put in here is all going to depend on your own wishes. Some people like these at higher levels, like they might just conduct benchmarking research and that's it. They don't want to get into the details. Others may feel like they need to break it down. The way I think about this is, what are your resources? Like, if you have to imagine it, who's going to do it, and when is it going to happen, and how are you going to pay for it? Usually that's how you're trying to break down the items. Every time it's a unique resource, it should be usually an item. It makes it easier for you. Okay, so this is daunting. This is not easy. This is going to take some creative thinking. It's going to do some brainstorming. Some of it's going to work, some of it's not going to work. That's the idea. Okay, I'm going to give you some good time on this. You're going to have at least a half an hour to start and try to map this out. Don't worry about making this messy or anything like that. I'll take whatever you end up with lots of notes and things crossed out. It's all fine with me, okay? Do the best you can, basically. So I'm going to give you about a half an hour's time. I'll gauge you based on the activity around the table. I will circulate it now and then. We may break in between with a few things I'll add up, or add, where it might be helpful. Sounds okay? Not easy. So, away you go. Yeah. Okay. Interesting exercise. I heard lots of really fantastic discussions happening, and it really did help bring out a few things that I'm hoping in the debrief we can actually work with. The fact is that this kind of work, as you can tell, there is a level of complexity to it. There's a lot of decision points. There's a lot of things you need to think about as you're preparing a plan. And a lot of the observations are things like, you can't do this in isolation, like as an organization, and the way you need to be thinking about other variables. A lot of people brought up things like, well, my plan might change in the midterm because of variables that come into play, like, I don't know, reduced resources or delays with contractors, and so I'm going to have to adjust. And people brought up things like, how do I monitor the quality of what we're doing? But it provoked a lot of discussion overall, and I think it gave you a sense of where some people are at with some of their work and their planning at the same time. Anyway, that said, what I want to do now is hear from each table, not necessarily about your list, although it can be about your list if you want, but what did you gain out of this exercise? Like, what is it that you sort of realized or learned that you think would be beneficial for everyone to be thinking about? The list, after all, is something I will collect and will compile, so we can look at the list if you want. But mostly I want to know, what did you get out of this exercise? What did it teach you? What did you learn from it? What are your sort of points of wisdom that you might want to pass on about some of this planning? So we were looking at this briefly yesterday. I want to get into it in a little more depth. It's highly related to some of the work you were just dealing with. Small reminder, this diagram is all about a feasibility or needs assessment. In a way, it's like that first stage of planning of a project whatsoever. It's what you will use or could use to help determine whether you're going to proceed at all with the development of a standard. At best, it will help you get a good plan and at least know what to do so that it's feasible. Okay? The workbook contains a page for each one of these. I think it starts with 4, and then it's 5, 6, and 7. There's more detail in here. So if you look at the item 4, I keep forgetting, situational analysis, we already commented on the number of bullets underneath here. This is just a kind of high-level summary of those. But I do suggest that if you are following this route, that you basically take the time and you go through this. Answering questions like describing program objectives takes some time. That's one bullet. Yesterday you worked on one item, define stakeholder categories. That's about the 8th or 9th bullet down. And we spent a little bit of time on that, but you didn't even get that far. But it behooves you to take the time to work through these. They may not all be relevant. I don't know all the context. But if you've got this laid out, it really sets the stage for you in making decisions on other things. This list comes about from maybe about 5 or 6 workshops now, where people have also fed in additional comments, so that's why they are what they are. Okay? So other people were working on these and they added some thoughts to it. Same here, if you've got ideas like that you think should be added to this list, I will compile them and add them in the future. Beyond the basic situation though, as I was saying yesterday, if you don't have enough of a case after just doing this first stage, it would suggest that you're not ready or there isn't a demand to actually do the standard. So from a resource point of view, this is also a helpful thing to start with. Spend your time on this. If you get through this gate, you're ready for the next one. If you don't, there's still decisions that have to be made. So don't waste your time on starting to do other activities. I don't know if you would have a chance to look at this, of course, but if you had questions about any one of these things, just let me know and we can pick them up. So that was the issue sheet around that, or the item around it. There has been requests to get into things like defining target markets and so on, and having additional worksheets that actually help people work through those ideas. Because sometimes, like describing program objectives, well, where do you start? What does the program objective look like? What might it say? How would you write one? And these are the questions I've had by many others. My thought is, as I move forward, I might actually start to do some of that work. But meanwhile, it's just an outline. I wish I had more for you. But as you work together on this, as soon as you've got a good example of someone who's done a situational analysis, share it. Distribute the wealth. Give people an idea of how you did it. You'll gain feedback, but also it'll start to pattern some good behavior and exercises around it and borrow from it. You'll save a lot of time. And imagine if you did produce this, how you could actually go talk to your committees and your board and build a case rapidly. In the end, that's pretty much what I would expect they would ask about. Okay. The second category, though, is that whole stakeholder engagement one. That's item number 5. In the sheet, again, there's more detail. But I want to bring to your attention this idea of these stages. Most often when people talk about setting standards, they do describe it as a cycle or a process of activity. So there is planning, there is development, there is implementation, and there's maintenance and renewal. We didn't get a chance to talk a whole lot about that question of maintenance and renewal. But your work plans are never finite, right? You might get out of the gate and you might publish a product and you might be able to distribute it, but it doesn't end there. You have to manage it, you have to maintain it, you have to collect feedback on it, and so on. We're going to be getting into that in the next topic. This is a big responsibility to take on ultimately. Now, you can do this in a relatively low-scale, simple approach and maintain it minimally, or you could be more robust with that. It all depends on your resources. But the more resources you have, the more opportunities that will come about, and the more pervasive the standard will be used in the marketplace. So we'll talk about that in the next series of slides in a moment. But do remember in your work plans to think about this question. It actually starts right up front, because you've got to build a plan to know that you can maintain it. So how are you going to collect information on the use of these standards over time, for example? It should be part of your logic in your planning. See what I mean? And we'll get to that in detail. But I just wanted to highlight that. You did look at this a little bit yesterday. Who do you consult, why, in what order, what roles do they play? It's well worth the trouble to do so. And there will always be people that want to do things that they're not fit for, but you manage that, right? And it's not always about the willing and the able and the friendly that are at the table. Sometimes it's the unfriendly and the difficult and the ones that are not always so pleasant to deal with. But in the end, you know what? They all come out converted, seriously. And without it, you'd have trouble. Item number 6 is a bit about what you were just doing now, but a very simplified example of it. Now, the logic behind these 4 components is that it would help you build a business plan to do this. In a way, might actually be the tenets of a proposal to get funding to do this as well. So this is meant to be reasonably straightforward. Here, not the kind of detail you were working on necessarily, but what would the overall activities be in your work plan? What do you need to do to get them done? Who's going to do it? What kind of resources would you use, and what are the success measures? Those are basically the things that are asked for in a funding proposal. If you're going to go after funding for this, and you've now built your case and you've got your engagement, then you better tell them how you're going to get it done. And that's basically what this idea was about. Because you need to define the resources and get an action plan, and then the next stage actually is to go and shop that action plan to get these materials. So you might think of this as the basis of the proposal template. Now, I don't know the funding proposals in the province here, but you can overlay that, and I'm sure it's going to cover a lot of the same categories. Again, people who've worked on these should share them. You know, it's golden to have a sample from one of your colleagues who's done it, because you can lend, you can just benefit so greatly from adapting rather than having to think through everything. And the more that people do it, then the more opportunity you get at improving on it. Okay, this last one was going to be a bit of an exercise we were going to do, but I think time won't permit it. For this reason, I didn't actually provide the normal outline supply, which is more detailed than what you see on here. But I want you to look at this for a moment and think critically about what you would have to worry about when it comes to results. First of all, you need to get a real good handle on the financial requirements. So I'm sure you were struggling with this as groups, I heard it. How much time does it take to do this? What kind of resources are involved in getting these committees to meetings? What are the real cost components of doing standards? There are many. Some of them are easy to imagine, others are difficult. Like, for example, you know that a consultant's going to cost you between $600 and $1,000 a day on average. But how many days does it take to do a standard? Is it 10, 20, 50, 70? What is it going to be? How do you know, right? Or you're going to bring committees together. Those are easier budgets to figure out, because you could go and figure out what flights and rooms and accommodations are, so that's not so difficult. But how many people? How many events? Not easy, right? Now, there are some general guidelines around this, because there's been a lot of practice in setting standards, and so there are many, many examples out there that show what types of budgets have been allocated to this kind of work. So you're not going to have to start with a blank slate. There are many samples you can just get even by Googling. But in the end, you have to work within your means. So you might design a standards project that's going to have a consultant work for 50 days and have to fit it into that. Or maybe it's a 100-day exercise and you get more opportunity out of it. But anyway, I don't want to belabor the point, but this becomes a real fundamental planning point. And again, I want to reinforce, it's good to share. Right? If you figure out a work plan and you budgeted it and you can get it done economically and so on, it behooves you to share it with all your colleagues, because that can become a really good pattern for others to follow. Financial measures. At the same time, you need to be cost effective. You need to be looking and thinking about how you're going to do this most effectively. Right? You also have to find what are the success measures out of this. You're going to have to report on that as well. And it's not just about outputs. It's not just about when we got a document done and we had 20 people show up. But we might be saying things like, we were able to do this in less time with fewer resources, and here's how. Build a case around this. it really can matter greatly down the road, honestly. So, finally, optimization requirements. I really think that in today's climate with budget constraints and time, and I think actually Diane was trying to get at this yesterday, we all have to work together to decide how we can do this collectively so we're most economical with our efforts. So there's a lot of things that can be done with linking projects or activities together, share resources, spend time working on it together because you'll save a lot of effort. Pair up with other projects. If you're bringing communities together, make them do two things. Work them hard, you know. But you got to think that way because it's just not going to be affordable. So that's a general guideline. I wish we could have spent time on this, but I know that this kind of thing takes a day to do, like to work through it properly. And I just wanted to give you a flavor for that and give you a general outline to work with. But as you're working on those kinds of plans, this is actually a good series to reflect on. Theoretically, you would have done this all in advance, but that got you the funding. Now you're going to be in the woods of getting the work done. These are still good general guidelines to be imagining or thinking about. Okay. The thing about this kind of work, this is a model that is really about feasibility and building a case. So you could end up coming to the end of all of that and still decide not to proceed, by the way. You might get to the very end and there's just not, I don't know, the right kind of resources and time to get it done well. You may not proceed. So I'm just letting you, leaving you with that idea. It would be a bit tragic perhaps, but it's real. Okay, this is another piece that I supplied for you. There's also some 2 sheets or 3 sheets in there to help. I knew we would not get to this as part of our overall work, but I wanted to use another template, another idea. And it's around monitoring and evaluating. This gets a little bit at this quality idea, but it's a little bit higher order. So, this logic around this section is all around how you would monitor and evaluate the work that you're doing to see if you remain on track. Okay? So it does involve some classic stages: setting an evaluation plan, gathering evidence, analyzing, and determining action plans. The reason we talk about these with standards is because of that ongoing maintenance and renewal requirement. That is where this kicks in. You should be thinking about it up front in your planning, but in the end, this is kind of what the renewal and maintenance cycle is all about. You have to determine over time, first you set a plan to review what you're doing. This is what this is essentially about. Biggest job about maintenance and renewal is gathering evidence. You want to get examples, information. You want to find out how it's bearing in the marketplace. It's more than just how many people are downloading that standard or using it. But is the use of it relevant? Is the purpose for which it's intended working out? Yesterday we were hearing about these pilots happening with the framework. That's an example to me of validation, but also evidence collecting. Is it working? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Is there success measures out of it? Are people now employable? Is that the issue we're supposed to deal with, right? So you want to gather evidence. You've got to figure out what that evidence is as an indicator of whether your standard is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And enough people using it, and so on. So that's that stage. Analyzing it, of course, is reviewing that information and making decisions about it. And then the other one is setting an action plan. So that's your concept of renewal or to go with. So here's an example for you to work on. You've got 10 minutes, and this is going to be just a little brainstorming thing. But this is real, by the way. I'm going to read it out loud. It's a lot of text. It's a little case study, a little scenario. And you can use this as a piece to answer some of these worksheets or imagine your own case. So 1 year ago, you launched occupational standards for product specialists, a profession that was facing increasing more regulations and licensing requirements in order to represent export products, the most lucrative and sought-after commodity in the sector. Standards were well received in the market. You heard of no complaints, and there was steady download of the standards from your website. Luckily, the Alberta Product Specialists Guild featured the standards in their annual publication, and this resulted in few inquiries. Your board is asked how many product specialists are now using the standards. And one board member, a large employer of these product specialists, says the standards are good, but they're not helping his workers secure lucrative deals for export products and wonders why. You're asked to report on the impact of these standards and to set a plan that will help specialists get the export product contracts. You know, the place to start is to get a good handle on what's happening with the standard. So this kind of notion of a case study is very real, by the way. You're going to find yourself in these booths. Of course, let me get this scenario. You're going to get the standard out. It's going to look like it's doing well. You're going to get downloads. You're going to get good rapport. You're going to get nearly no feedback. And you can only hope that things are going well because that's as good as it gets from what you're gaining for information. But you start hearing things like this. This question in a way is saying, is it actually doing what it's supposed to do? Now, it might be, but we don't actually know. We just know this employer is not so sure about it, and he doesn't have evidence. And he's a big player, and there could be a lot of folks up there, right? And boy, we better make sure he's okay. And your board's asking the question. I'm sure you'll all get your boards asking these questions at some point, or somewhere. So how are you going to monitor this? How are you going to be able to determine if this is actually doing what it's supposed to? How do you build that into your plans up front so that you're ready to answer those questions? In fact, if you built it in up front, you probably won't even get this question asked because you'll be able to report on what is happening and what's not happening or have other alternatives. So with that kind of logic in mind and the notion of maintenance and monitoring what's happening, that's what these sheets are about. And you've got, I think, 2 pages with this. And when you're thinking about your planning, I do recommend that you think about this at the same time and you answer the questions. Sometimes it starts with the basic thing. Why do you want to have a plan? So for your survey, what does it mean to collect? Some basic issues here. The big one, though, is what evidence do you need to collect? Spend time on this. What evidence can you collect? What do you think is going to actually give you some indication of whether these standards are doing what they're supposed to? You know, all those things you said right up front about why you were doing the standard, that's exactly what you should be looking at. If this standard was to improve the curriculum out there, was to improve employment, was to improve mobility, whatever it was, well, what's your evidence? Get a list out and go after it. This is really important. Otherwise, again, you did a really fantastic job and love these standards and engagement, but you can't make any difference. Other than get a lot of people happy and engaged. So you have to think about this up front, and you really should be very mindful of getting these in place in your planning. The thing about this is, though, it's difficult. It takes resources. You don't have access to this information like this all the time. You may have to build relationships. There may be very little data that's actually collected around the kinds of things that you want. So it's not easy. So you've got to do the best you can and think about ways to do it as creatively as possible. But collect evidence is my message. The more you collect, the better you can actually describe what's happening. By collecting this as well, it's telling you how well your standard is performing, and is it due for an update? Is there some change that have to be done? Are there issues that are resulting from it? Sometimes there's unintended consequences.
Just wondering, just in kind of a mind concept, I'm thinking qualitative versus quantitative type of evidence. How you kind of frame that?
You know, I think people want both types of evidence because they're going to want to know the number of downloads of standards. That, for some people, resonates, and there's a big number there, and it helps. And it says there's some level of demand. You can't tell how they're being used, but it's a good indicator nonetheless. But qualitative things are mattering the most in the end in terms of your objectives. Like, did the college actually adapt its curriculum now to meet your standards? And are those graduates coming into the workplace where the employer says they're a better fit for their needs? Boy, if you can answer that question, that's golden, right? But these things take time and evidence to collect. So I do think go after what you can get, period. Because it's all about what can you collect.
Kind of like body of evidence almost. You sit in front of a tribunal and say, well, here's the candlestick and here's the...
Yeah. And I'll tell you, just to lead you down this hard path for a while, our council had 55 standards in place, and we decided to retire a good number of them. after 18 years of them in the marketplace. We decided to retire 2 of our certification programs after some 15 years in the marketplace. So there are times when, because of the monitoring, maybe the product's not as liked for different reasons. So this is one of those things. You're not going to maintain this if there's no reason to, or maybe there's a different solution now that you've got to worry about. Okay. And the analysis is just the concept of reviewing, just a small framework there to help you, like one of the things you should think about. But in the end, you're going to have to build a plan all the time. Like you should be monitoring and keeping track, and this is going to cycle back into another proposal that Diane's going to look at funding if she has money for you to update and maintain these standards. Now there's 2 kinds of major updates. You know, there's the basic errata things. You've got to fix a spelling error, or there's some wonky thing that happened in the printing, or you've got to, I don't know, you missed a person's name on the acknowledgement slip. Those things are routine. They don't require special conditions. Just fix them, get them back in there, get on with it. I mean, those are routinely done in publications today, and it's expected. But don't let them sit, because that makes people mad. And also, something like a simple spelling error in a document diminishes the whole sense of its quality and integrity. So just fix the thing and get on with it. But that reminds me of another point. You want to design this in a publication that's easy for you to do that with. You notice today very, very few people will publish these as hard documents. It's so easy today to do publish, like to print on demand and to make them downloadable in PDF formats and so on. It's because it's economical and because it's simple to make changes. You start printing volumes of them to store, well, that's a headache because they're going to get dated. What do you do with all that? So think about that. But anyway, keep a running tab because you'll end up with work plans as a result of that. So I gave you these worksheets. They're very general ones, but they do help you just from a planning point of view to think about where you need to be sort of on the other end of that cycle. And when you're engaging stakeholders up front, think about the evidence things. Like you could start planting those seeds with them, saying, you know, you're an educator, you're involved in our standards work. You think you're going to start using these for your curriculum work? Oh, that's great. So now that you're going to use them, can I get feedback from you? Like what kind of feedback can you supply me? Can you give me your numbers of graduates? Can you tell me whether you're this, you know, how did it work for you to work to design your curriculum with this, and so on. Get them to tell you what they can do and get them committed on it where you can. It's a hard one. Our council really struggled with this because we didn't go out and be thinking about this much up front. And then we tried to play catch up. And our most recent standards, we are really delighted by the feedback we're getting and the amount of data we can collect. Some of our earlier standards, it's like pulling teeth. It's very, very hard to get evidence around. Okay.